Hello, viewers. I'm your host, Shanai Prasad, and welcome to our program on the reflections of the 2020 general elections. Joining me is Mr. Sase Gunraj, Commissioner of GECOM. Mr. Gunraj, thank you for being here.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
Awesome. So, can you remind the viewers some of the fundamentals of democracy?
Well, fundamentals of democracy. Democracy is such a bandied about term. We speak so much about democracy. Sometimes I believe that people who speak about democracy don't even understand what the term means. However, one of the fundamental pillars of a democracy, a functioning democracy, and one of the hallmarks by which a country is judged for democratic practices is elections. And by elections, what do I mean? I mean the regular holding of elections, elections that are conducted in a free, fair, and free from fear manner. That is to say, that persons, including stakeholders or participants in the process, in the form of contestants and electors, those are persons who are voting, have confidence in the process. Now, in a functioning democracy or a state, there are many other aspects that are considered when we speak about a democracy or a functioning democracy. You have aspects of the way that the government conducts its work, the impact of the government's work on the people, the judiciary, the manner in which the judiciary functions, etc. All of these concatenate to determine the health or otherwise of a democracy. Uh, Elections, of course, as I said, are a fundamental part. And the juncture at which we are and the events that we are reflecting upon touch and concern that most important or that very important aspect of the democratic process, and that is to say, elections.
Awesome. So, 2 years ago, on March 2nd, 2020, what really led to the prolonged declaration of the victor?
I wish I could say it was 2 years ago. It certainly feels like it's now 3 years.
3 years
It's
ago,
now
yes.
2023. You know, Shania, it's easy for us to attempt to rehash all those gory details as to what occurred. Um, those matters are now well documented, and I could make it very simple. I could praise it, to say the least, that clearly there was an attempt by some very deranged minds, because I don't know how they believe they could have gotten away with such a nefarious act. But clearly, some person or persons got together and decided that they were going to subvert the electoral process, thereby depriving the electorate of their will. Uh, on March 2nd, 2020, now 3 years ago, persons voted in what was a very peaceful, uh, uneventful day, elections day. You then had the results, and elections results are very small bits that are then uh, tabulated for us to get national results. The result of every single polling station is recorded on statements of poll, and those statements of poll, the first copy is posted publicly outside, and the law says in a conspicuous place outside of the polling station. That is placed outside. So, if you, for example, voted at Campbellville Government School, you could have gone there sometime after 6 p.m. when polls closed and the ballots were counted there, and know what was the result at your station.
Right.
However, the national results or the the regional results will be determined by tabulation of those statements of vote. Clearly, in regions 1, 2, 3, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10, the process went very smoothly. There were declarations in all of those districts. There were no complaints. There were no issues. District 4, which coincides with Administrative Region 4, is the largest district, uh, accounting for just under one-third of the total number of polling stations. Uh, and that is where the attempt was made to uh, fudge the numbers so as to project a winner that had not actually won the elections. That was 2020 in a nutshell. That was 2020 in a nutshell. Uh, the delayed process, resulted in a string of legal challenges. And when I said earlier on in response to your first question in relation to the pillars of democracy, one of the aspects that I mentioned was the manner in which the judiciary functions. In 2020, great reliance was placed on the judiciary because there were several court challenges, and in effect, almost every aspect of our electoral laws was examined and judicially determined by the courts. It became very necessary.
Right. So we know that even after the elections, there was unrest in society. What were some of the proceedings that happened for there to be so much riots within society?
Riots is a strong word. Um, uh, what we traditionally refer to as riots in terms of unrest in the streets and so on, um, thankfully, a lot of that did not occur. And while I don't want to sit here and hazard a guess as to why, the uh, the development or the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, in my humble opinion, might have had an effect on that. Because no doubt, if you had persons who were willing to subvert the electoral process in such a sadistic manner, like they did, um, no doubt, a resort to no doubt a resort to protests might have been another one of the ploys that they would have utilized. Um, that might have been muted or minimized by COVID. But you do recall in the early aspects, March 4th, 5th, 6th, etc., and the following week, 10, 12, 13, there was an attempt to have some persons protest and so on. But that was short-lived. Maybe the sensible so-called supporters of the PNC by that time had realized that they were waging an improper battle anyhow.
And how did the elections observers and international community assist with the preservation of Ghana's democracy?
Elections observers, international community, and I want to add at this juncture, importantly, civil society groups, both locally and overseas. The conjoined effect of those sections of society, both locally and internationally, I believe played an important role in that they were independent in the process, first of all. Elections observers is not something that is known alone to Ghana. It's an international process. I myself have participated in electoral missions in several parts of the world. Uh, and one of the duties of electoral observers is to observe key benchmarks in the electoral process to ensure that those benchmarks are met. And it is based on that that they make a comment or a critique, and in some in relation to their observations, and then sometimes make recommendations for the improvement of the process. At the end of the day, in most instances, the electoral observer groups make public pronouncements on the free and fairness, etc., of the elections, based on those benchmarks by which their observation is done. In relation to civil society groups and in relation to international organizations, recall that the utopia that the world looks for is a world of democratic nations existing coherently and cohesively with each other. So, states that do not conform to those norms ought to be shunned upon, or ought to be shunned, and ought to be frowned upon. Clearly, if Guyana was allowed to proceed down that very perilous path that it was going, obviously, it would not have augured well for both local affairs and international affairs. I believe it is in recognition of that international organizations and some governments and diplomatic by their diplomatic representatives, etc., understood and observed, because this was such a naked attempt that as long as you had eyes, you would see what the mischief that was being perpetrated on the Guyanese public, and particularly the Guyanese electorate. And as a consequence, I believe they found it to be their duty to stand up and say something about what was occurring. And the fact that they had the courage, the fact that they had the independence to stand up and say something, meant that normalcy that should exist in a democratic country continue to exist. But while the voices were so loud in relation to the in relation to what was actually happening, you had some organizations that were very deafening in their silence in relation to what was happening. While I will not, because I may not be able to provide an exhaustive list of those who commented, and more importantly, those who did not comment, or comment in the least, criticize in at best on this issue. You had organizations that did not do that. And that included some persons in high office. And I'll get to those in a second. But those organizations that failed and are neglected to comment or to criticize what was happening, that was, like I said, there for even the blind to see. You have to ask yourself, why? You had to ask yourself what was their objective. You had to ask yourself what was their agenda. And that is an important question. Because while it may not have been apparent then, it is very apparent now that a lot of those organizations that were silent in the face of that blatant rigging attempt, sometimes now, and when I say now, in present day, sometimes they make the most interesting, to say the least, comments and criticisms of government policy, occurrences in society, and other events which pale in comparison to those very horrendous events of 2020. And their silence then must be juxtaposed to their advocacy now. And once you do that, quickly an agenda is exposed. Quickly an agenda is discerned as to why they were silent then. Now, when I speak of persons in high office, recall we had commissioners on the Ghana Elections Commission that up to today have not come out in criticism to the actions of the likes of Bingo, and then further the actions of the likes of Lowenfield, who blatantly, in the face of several judicial pronouncements, orders by the court to tabulate results even after a national recount had been done, to tabulate results in a particular manner, a manner that has been set out in law, and a manner that had been judicially considered and determined and sanctioned. And yet, you had someone in the likes of Lowenfield who chose to disenfranchise hundreds of thousands of voters, in some instances, tens of thousands of voters in the process. But you never had, you didn't have some of our own commissioners some of my fellow commissioners on the Ghana Elections Commission have not condemned those actions. In fact, the Ghana Elections Commission, this is all public knowledge. The Ghana Elections Commission had one commissioner representing the government, advocating a cause for non-declaration. Advocating a cause for non-declaration after an electoral process had determined a winner, a recount had confirmed that winner, after the court had made certain pronouncements on how those results were to be tabulated. You had someone with the audacity to advocate publicly a position that was not known to law. It makes you wonder.
So, since assuming office, what are some measures the current government has put in place to ensure that democracy is met throughout the country?
Insofar as it relates, and I'll prefer to confine my answers to the electoral process.
Okay.
As you know, there are two new pieces of legislation that were promulgated in the parliament and have now been enacted in law. Basically and specifically designed to cure the mischief that was revealed by the 2020 elections, which we are now discussing. An amendment to the Representation of the People Act, Chapter 103 of the Laws of Ghana, and an amendment to the National Registration Act, Chapter 1908 of the Laws of Ghana. Let me pause there to interject it. GECOM has two primary functions. One is to register persons, and two is to conduct elections. So the registration of persons is captured in great detail in the National Registration Act, and the manner of conduct of elections, at least national elections, general and regional elections, is captured in 103, the Representation of the People Act. And the reform of those two pieces of legislation, which benefited from great public consultation, which benefited from the input from several civic groups, civil society organizations, etc. It was exposed for public scrutiny, and a lot of the views of those organizations were incorporated into that piece of legislation. And as a consequence, it now forms part of our laws. And there are several measures, including, importantly, very strict and harsh penalties for persons who attempt to repeat, or who will dare attempt to repeat, the shenanigans of 2020.
Okay. And lastly, Mr. Gunraj, what is the role of the Presidential Commission of Inquiry in playing a role to safeguard democracy?
The terms of reference, including the specific objectives of the Presidential Commission of Inquiry, is a public document. The rules based on the rules upon which that commission was envisaged to conduct its work. 3 years later, and not to publicize your mistake earlier on, you said 2 years ago. It feels as though we are beginning to forget some of these events. I myself wish they never happened so that I didn't have to forget it. But uh, someone famous once said, those who forget the past are condemned to repeat it. After the after the 2020 debacle, as it were, which interestingly, as I said earlier on, occurred while COVID was on blast. The world was experiencing this pandemic that was defined as the COVID-19 uh, virus, COVID-19 pandemic. And you had this happening in a country. The world, in some instances, was in a stalemate. Guyana was no different, but Guyana had to deal with the added issue of people trying to steal an elections, and that's just what it was. After that elections issue was resolved, you had a swearing in of a government which then now had to take the bull by the horns to ensure that a country is run, that the needs of the people are met. Because, as you recall, precious little was being done in terms of welfare and extensive health care and all of that in relation to COVID. Government had a country to run. There were so many other issues to address. I believe the people, the general population, was happy that at least one of these two issues was now resolved, and people tried to get their lives back to a sense of normalcy. In many regards, people sought some of the issues of GECOM began to fell away. A lot of people who people's focus, as it was correctly, people's focus was on getting their lives back on track, and a lot of the culpability and persons who were responsible for that elections debacle, there was never a proper inquiry into those events to determine culpability, to determine who the authors, intellectual or otherwise, were of that series of events. And so I believe it is in recognition of that. And recognition, I believe, or a response by the President, Honorable Dr. Irfan Ali, to the needs of the citizens. First of all, to have some clarity as to what's really happened in that process. And two, to ensure that a determination is made of the issues and to determine the loopholes, etc., that presented themselves so as to prevent a reoccurrence. And I believe it is in that vein that the presidential inquiry is necessary to do that examination for those stated purposes.
Great. Thank you for being here, Mr. Gunraj.
Thank you very much.
That brings us to the end of our program on the reflections of the 2020 general elections, where we heard from Commissioner of GECOM, Mr. Sase Gunraj. Thank you for watching.